I know you, Caleb Stone. You were the soldier who shot my husband.
I'm sorry. I never meant to.
She was forced to marry the enemy, but he protected her like his own soul. Caleb Cal Stone stood at his rickety porch, staring at a woman whose face he'd never seen before, but whose ghost had haunted him for 20 long years. The entire town of Red Rock Pass had gathered, not to witness a spectacle, but to watch him, Cal, the ghost of a man, finally face the past he had so desperately tried to bury. They were wrong about what they were about to see. Just 3 days earlier, Cal had been the most solitary man in the territory. His small cabin was his only refuge, his old roan horse, his only companion. He owned little more than the clothes on his back and the ghosts in his mind. He was a man who lived on the fringes of society, a relic of a time that was as dead and buried as the men he'd outlived. He was Cal Stone, once a name that commanded respect in the cavalry, now just a whisper that brought only scorn. But pride, as his old sergeant used to say, was for men who still had something left to lose. The reckoning came in the form of a young boy with a face as weathered as the red rocks of the desert, who arrived on a Tuesday morning. He didn't announce himself, just rode up to the cabin on a scrawny mare and silently offered a small woven rug. Inside, Cal found a beaded Apache design, its colors muted with age, its thread worn thin. "A debt repaid," the boy whispered before riding off without another word. Cal felt his stomach drop. He knew that pattern, just as he knew the ghost that wore it. He'd never seen her face, but the memory of the day he'd earned it was a scar he carried deeper than any bullet wound. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Cal felt the weight of the rug like a physical burden, a chain binding him to a past he'd tried to forget. He'd come to this desolate corner of the Wild West to escape his reputation, to live out his days in quiet, agonizing solitude. But a man can't outrun his own shadow, and Cal Stone's shadow was a long and bloody one. 2 decades ago, he was a different man. Young, a soldier for hire known for his scouting skills in the cavalry. He'd been good at what he did, a talent that made him both respected and feared. But that life, as it always did, had come with a price he paid in blood and regret. Now, holding the delicate beads in his hand, he felt the weight of a debt that could never be settled with cash. The rug was a ghost, and the boy who sent it was a harbinger. A few days later, a new kind of trouble arrived in Red Rock Pass. A man named Sterling Price, a railroad agent who'd traded his company uniform for a 3-piece suit. He was a slick operator, a man who didn't fight with guns but with ledgers and legal papers. Price rode into town with a polished air and a cruel glint in his eye, and everyone knew he was bad news. He was the kind of man who would tear down a whole town just to lay a single rail. When he saw Cal, his eyes lit up with a predatory interest. "Caleb Stone," Price said, his voice a mocking drawl. "Heard you've got something of mine." Cal knew instantly what he was talking about. He clutched the rug tighter in his pocket. "Don't know what you're talking about, Price." "Don't play coy," Price said, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "The Apache trinket. Word is, it's not just a piece of old cloth. Word is, it's a map to a lost Apache treasure, a fortune in gold, buried on Indian land." Cal's blood ran cold. He had no idea what the man was talking about, but he knew what Price's words meant. A gold rush, more land grabs, more violence, all because of a rug he was now saddled with. The thought made his skin crawl, but the alternative, giving it to Price, made his blood run colder. He knew what men like Price would do to get their hands on what they wanted. "It ain't a map," Cal said, his voice low and firm. "It's a peace offering, something I earned years ago." Price laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Peace offering? You and the Apache? Don't make me laugh, Stone. Everyone knows you're the last man on earth they'd ever make peace with." The words hit Cal like a physical blow. He'd spent 20 years living with the knowledge that he was responsible for an Apache woman losing her fiancé in a cavalry skirmish. He'd never seen her face, never heard her name, but the memory of that fateful day, the bullet that went astray, was seared into his soul. It was a debt he could never repay. And now, holding a rug that belonged to her, he felt a flicker of hope, a chance to finally set things right, even if it meant facing a past he'd spent his life running from. "This is all a big misunderstanding, Price," Cal said, his hand straying to the handle of his gun, a relic he hadn't touched in years. "The rug ain't worth a damn thing." "Maybe not to you," Price sneered, "but to me, it's a fortune, and I'm prepared to pay handsomely for it. Or, I can take it, and you know what happens to men who get in my way." Cal had seen what happened to men who refused Price. They disappeared. Their bodies were found days later, or sometimes they weren't found at all. The choice was brutal in its simplicity. Give Price the rug and condemn a whole tribe to ruin, or face his own destruction. That night, Cal sat on his porch and stared at the stars, trying to imagine what his life would become. He'd lived his life on a soldier's code, a code that demanded loyalty and honor. He'd broken that code once, and it had cost him everything. He wasn't going to do it again. The rug was no longer a burden. It was a mission, a chance to finally find peace with his past. He would not give it up. The next morning, he rode out of town, leaving his cabin and his quiet life behind. He had one goal: to find the woman, the ghost of his past, and return her rug. He rode for 3 days, following a trail of hushed rumors and old tribal stories, until he found her. She lived in a small, solitary wickiup, nestled among the red rock formations. Her name was Ayanna, and she was every bit as formidable as the stories had told him. She was a weaver, an artist, and a protector of her people, and she knew exactly who he was and what he'd come for. "I know you, Caleb Stone," she said, her voice a calm, unwavering stream of water. "You were the soldier who shot my husband." Cal felt his stomach knot. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to." "I know," she said, her eyes meeting his. "It was an accident. The bullet was meant for the man next to him, but it was your bullet that took his life. And for that, you have always carried a debt." Cal felt the weight of his guilt, the pain of 20 years of regret. "I have come to repay that debt," he said, offering her the rug. Ayanna looked at the rug, then at him. "This rug is not a debt, Caleb. It is a key to a secret my people have held for centuries. And now that you have it, you have a new debt to repay. A debt not just to me, but to my people." Cal looked into her eyes and saw not hate, but understanding. Not anger, but a calm, unwavering strength. He saw a woman who had lost everything but had not been broken. He saw his own redemption. "I am here to help you," he said, his voice a quiet vow. "I will do whatever it takes." 4. Đoạn 2, 1300 chữ. After that first, long-overdue meeting, Cal and Ayanna became an unlikely pair. A former cavalryman and an Apache weaver bound by a past they both regretted. She lived in a world of ancient tradition and deep-seated wisdom, a world that was a complete mystery to him. He, in turn, was a man of the gun, a relic of a frontier that was fast disappearing, a frontier Ayanna's people had been trying to survive for centuries. They spent the next few days in a tense, watchful silence, communicating more with gestures and shared glances than with words. He'd never been a man of many words, and she had an unspoken understanding of a world he'd only ever seen from the outside. He stayed in a makeshift camp near her wickiup, watching her as she went about her day. She moved with a silent grace, tending to her herbs and plants, her hands moving with a practiced, confident ease. She was an artist, and he was a man who needed healing more than he knew. He saw the strength in her eyes, the resilience of a woman who had endured more than he could ever imagine, and he felt a strange sense of comfort, a peace he hadn't felt in years. "What is the secret of the rug?" he asked one day, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Ayanna looked at him, her eyes as deep as the desert sky. "The rug is not a map to gold, Cal. It is a key to our history. It is a record of our land, a testament to our right to be here. It contains a code, a message that can only be understood by one who knows the land, as well as my people." Cal felt a surge of hope. This wasn't a greedy quest for gold, it was a righteous fight for justice. A cause he could believe in, a debt he could truly repay. The next morning, they began their journey. Their destination was a sacred canyon, a place where the Apache had gathered for centuries, a place where the secrets of the rug could be revealed. But the world outside their small, quiet corner of the desert was not quiet. The railroad company and Sterling Price were still hunting for them. Price had hired a new gun, a ruthless bounty hunter with a reputation as cold as a mountain peak. His name was Jeb Price, Sterling's older brother, a man who believed in nothing but money and violence. Jeb was a shadow, a phantom who moved through the desert with a chilling efficiency. Cal knew him by reputation. He was the kind of man who would kill a whole town just to get to his target. Cal felt a familiar cold dread, but this time it was different. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for Ayanna. Jeb Price and his men ambushed them near a shallow river crossing. It was a classic trap, and Cal felt the rush of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. But this time, it wasn't about him. It was about protecting Ayanna. He moved with a speed that belied his age, his old Colt .45 a familiar weight in his hand. He wasn't a young soldier anymore, but the skills he'd learned in his youth were still there, buried deep beneath the dust of time. He fired, not to kill, but to disable, to scatter the men, to buy them time to escape. "Get to cover," he shouted to Ayanna, his voice a raw command. "Don't stop for anything." Ayanna didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the rocky bank, her movements as fluid and silent as a ghost's. Cal stayed behind, laying down cover fire, his heart pounding in his chest. He was a man fighting to protect something he'd never had, a reason to be a hero. He was no longer running from his past. He was fighting to save his future. The gunfight was a blur of smoke and lead. Cal took a bullet in his arm, a searing pain that brought him back to reality. He had to escape, to live to fight another day. He made a break for it, scrambling up the riverbank, his old bones protesting with every step. He could hear Jeb's angry shouts behind him, but he didn't stop. He found Ayanna waiting for him at the top of the ridge, her face a mask of concern. She took one look at his bleeding arm, and her eyes widened. "We have to go," she said, her voice a low whisper. "We can't stay here." They rode through the night, the twin pains of his wound, and her silent worry a constant companion. They found a small cave, a hidden sanctuary from the outside world. Ayanna, the weaver, took charge. She cleaned his wound with a mixture of herbs and water, her hands gentle and confident. She was more than just an artist. She was a warrior, a protector, a woman of unyielding strength. "You took a bullet for me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You are not the man you once were, Caleb Stone." Cal looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her eyes, at the quiet determination that radiated from her. "I'm just a man trying to do what's right, Ayanna." For the first time in a long time, she didn't answer, but her eyes held a new kind of warmth, a new kind of respect. The world outside was filled with danger, but in that small cave, with her by his side, Cal felt a profound sense of peace. He had faced his past, and he had found his future. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a common enemy. They were two people who had found a common purpose, a shared destiny. But as dawn broke, they knew their time was limited. Jeb Price would not give up. He would hunt them relentlessly until he had his prize. And Cal knew that to win this fight, he would have to become the man he used to be, the man he'd sworn he'd never be again. He would have to embrace his past, to become a soldier once more. But this time, he would fight not for a uniform or a paycheck, but for honor, for justice, for love. He would fight for Ayanna. He would fight for a chance at a new life, a new beginning. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. B5. Đoạn 3. 1.300 chữ. The escape from Jeb Price's ambush was a temporary reprieve, not a final victory. Cal and Ayanna knew they couldn't simply disappear. Price, backed by the railroad company, had too much reach, too much power. They were ghosts, but the world had ways of hunting down ghosts. They rode for another day, the pain in Cal's arm a constant, throbbing reminder of their situation. Ayanna, a master of her land, led them to a hidden Apache village, a small, quiet community nestled deep in the canyon. It was a place of refuge, a sanctuary from the storm, but even here, the shadow of Sterling Price loomed large. Price, a master of manipulation, had already spread his lies. He'd painted Cal as a thief and a murderer, a man who had stolen a priceless artifact from the Apache people and was now holding a tribal woman hostage. The town of Red Rock Pass, fueled by rumor and prejudice, had turned on Cal. His cabin was seized, his meager possessions confiscated. He was, for all intents and purposes, a wanted man. The isolation was a familiar companion for Cal, but this time it felt different. He was no longer alone. He had Ayanna, a woman who saw through the lies, a woman who believed in him. But their bond, fragile as it was put to the ultimate test. Price, ever the opportunist, used his connections to get a warrant for Cal's arrest, a warrant based on his false claim. He assembled a group of vigilantes, men who saw Cal not as a victim, but as a target. They were fueled by a mix of greed and righteous anger, a dangerous combination. They found Cal and Ayanna in the village, surrounded by a small, protective circle of Apache warriors. The confrontation was tense. Price, with his slick, civilized demeanor, presented the warrant to the Apache elders. "This man is a criminal," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "He must answer for his crime." The elders looked at Ayanna, then at Cal. They knew Price was a liar, but the law was the law, and Cal was a white man, an outsider. Ayanna spoke up, her voice clear and strong. "Caleb Stone is no criminal. He is an honorable man. He is a protector." Price laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Protector? He's a man who's living on borrowed time, on borrowed land, with a stolen artifact. The only thing he's protecting is himself." The words hit Cal hard. He felt a wave of despair, a sense of hopelessness. He had tried to do the right thing, to pay his debt, to find his redemption. But the world was not a place of redemption. It was a place of darkness and cruelty. He was an old man, and his time was running out. He had nothing left to lose. He was ready to give up, to surrender, to face his fate. "I will go with you, Price," Cal said, his voice a weary sigh. "But you will not touch Ayanna. She is innocent." Ayanna looked at him, her eyes wide with shock. "No, Cal, you can't." Price smiled, a triumphant, cold grin. "A deal. You come with me, and the woman is free." Cal knew it was a lie, a trick. But he also knew that if he fought, it would mean a bloody conflict, a conflict that would endanger the entire village. He had to make a choice between his own survival and Ayanna's safety. He chose Ayanna. He put his hands up, a silent gesture of surrender. The vigilantes moved in, their faces grim, their guns drawn. They put him in chains, a painful, humiliating act. As they led him away, Ayanna looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and admiration. She knew he had sacrificed himself for her. It was a moment of profound, wordless connection. He was not a hero. He was just a man, an old man who had made a mistake he was now paying for. But as they marched him back to town, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had faced his demons, and he had found a new kind of purpose. He was no longer running. He was standing his ground, for the first time in his life. He was protecting someone, and in doing so, he was finally finding his soul. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." They threw Cal into the town's small, dilapidated jail cell. He sat on the cold floor, the silence of the cell a stark contrast to the noise of the outside world. He knew he was a dead man. Price was not a man of his word. He would not let him live, not with the knowledge of the rug and the location of the sacred canyon. He would be found uncooperative or attempting escape and shot, and his death would be considered a just act. Ayanna, he hoped, was safe. That was all that mattered. But Ayanna, the woman who had lost her husband but not her will, was not the kind of woman to sit by and watch a good man die. She had been a ghost in his life for 20 years, and now she was a force of nature. She rode through the night, a silent, determined specter. She had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan. She would not let Cal Stone die. Not yet. Not when there was still so much left to fight for. Not when there was still a chance for redemption. She would not lose another man to the lies and greed of the white man. She would not let the man who had found his honor lose his life. And as she rode, a storm began to gather on the horizon, a storm of dust and vengeance, a storm that would shake the very foundations of Red Rock Pass. They camped in a crease of red rock that held night like a cup. Cal slept light, the way men do who have made too many enemies and outlived most of them. Ayanna slept lighter still, every rustle of sage her summons. By day she taught him the language of distances, how a cliff's shadow told the hour more faithfully than any town clock, how a black thread of cottonwood whispered water below. By night he taught himself how not to reach for the gun first when a wind changed, how to leave his back turned long enough to prove he could. He'd been a creature of edges for so long that the center felt like a kind of danger, and yet, sitting with his bad arm in a sling she'd knotted out of a blanket, he found that the silence between them didn't accuse him. It measured him. He could feel himself on the scale. "What is it you want from me?" he asked once, when the moon laid a rim of silver along the iron of his Colt where it rested by the bedroll. The sight, slick with moonlight, was a memory trying to become the present. "Not from you," Ayanna said. Her eyes reflected the small fire so that flames seemed to live inside them without burning. "With you, there is a difference." He swallowed around an old dryness. 20 years I've been paying for a bullet like a man pays for drink regular, and never enough." "You cannot pay the river back," she said, tilting her head toward the sound of water stitched through the rocks. "You learn to walk beside it." At dawn they rode out, the world wearing its early light like a promise it might keep. The secret of the rug lay in a canyon that pulled itself tight around a seam of green, where the Apache people had gathered since before the first white mapmaker drew a straight line across a crooked country. They took a path only the shadows knew, Ayanna leading, Cal a half-length behind, trying to match the hush of her pony's hooves. The wind rose late, a slow hand combing the desert, and brought with it the thin taste of rain from far off. It wasn't rain that found them. It was men. The river crossing looked shallow and kind, slick with pebbles like coins in a child's palm. Cal's neck prickled hard enough to lift hairs that had forgotten how. He smelled men the way an old wolf smells a trap. Oil, unwashed denim, a nail chewed to the quick and thrown aside. "Left bank," he murmured, the words a habit his mouth remembered before his mind did. "Two in the cottonwoods, one behind the split boulder." Ayanna didn't look at him. Her spine lengthened, her hands, loose on the reins, turned alert. How many more? He listened and hated how good he was at it, how easily the old mathematics slotted into place. Enough. They hit them in the water, where sound is confusing and footing worse. Jeb Price's gun spoke once, flat and cold, and the bullet flicked a splash exactly where Ayanna's knee would have been if she hadn't lifted her pony the way you lift a fence with a thought. Cal's Colt leapt to his hand. Moon had gone down, sun wasn't up. The world was that blue in between where a man's soul can wander. The first shot he took was not at a chest. He had killed enough chests. He took a shoulder hard, sent the rifle spinning. "Cover," he barked, voice cracking across years of orders he'd sworn off. Ayanna vanished into rock, the way a scribe vanishes into a page present even when unseen. Smoke and water made a taste like pennies, the air filled with lead and splintered bark, and the feathery gasp of bullets dying in sand. Cal's arm burned the bad one, and then it burned differently. He looked down and saw a hole in his sleeve blooming dark. He laughed the wrong way, a small breath through his teeth. Pain had always been cleaner than shame. He could use pain. He bought space with bullets not meant to kill. He bought time by being the older man they forgot to fear, because fear prefers its subjects young. He slid behind a rock low as a gravestone, and felt the stone's heat, still holding the memory of the sun from yesterday. On the other side of the rock, Jeb Price waited, patient as arithmetic, his boots set, the river drawing lines between them. Cal felt the mouth of death open with the courtesy of a gentleman host after you, and for the first time in years he didn't feel anger or even regret. He felt naked humiliation, the hot kind that lives inside a man's ribs when he understands his life can be taken in a place where no one will bother to know his name. Not like this, he thought, and he was surprised by the prayer in it. Ayana flashed across the gap, a streak of dun pony and black braid, and the white of her eyes. Jeb's shot took a bite out of rock where her waist had been. Cal stood into that shot, let it choose his arm instead of her lungs, and fired back, breaking Jeb's hat brim in half. Jeb didn't flinch. It wasn't flinching he was built for. "Go," Cal yelled. "Go." They went not forward, not back, but sideways into a cut where the river's voice turned from song to whisper. A cave shouldered into the bank, as if the world had grown a pocket for them. They slid into it, and in the instant the dark held them, Cal's body remembered that it is just meat, and started shaking. Ayana's hands were on him, not frantic, a pressure that made sense to bone. The cave smelled like damp rock and secrets. She packed the wound with moss, and something sharp as remedies get, tore her skirt for binding, and when he tried to apologize, she laid 2 fingers against his mouth, an order that made him smaller in the right way. "You did not die," she said. "We will use that." He wanted to tell her about the shame, the ugly little animal in him that snarled at the thought of being dragged by men who'd call him coward for not dying well enough. He wanted to say her name and let it mean more than gratitude. He said nothing. He watched the cave mouth grow lighter, inch by inch, and measured how much of himself was left. Enough to stand, enough to ride, not enough to refuse what came. They reached the hidden village by a route a crow might choose. The canyon gathered them in, its walls painted with a history no straight-line surveyor could unwrite. Children stared. Women watched with faces that did not blink away what they saw. Ayana spoke to an elder whose hair held the moon in a long gray rope. He touched Cal's bandage and nodded once, not like approval, more like inventory. Word traveled faster than horses. Sterling Price told the territory a story about theft and savagery and a white man who'd stolen an Apache treasure and enslaved a woman to help him spend it. Red Rock Pass drank the story like it was free whiskey. By morning, Cal's cabin was a place for other men's boots. By noon, there was a warrant that might have looked real if you didn't know the smell of ink and bribe. They came with that paper, a small army of those who love to be told what's right when it lets them do what they want. They found Cal standing where he could be found, the bandage on his arm like a flag he had not asked to fly. He could have run. It would have meant the village bled for him. He raised his hands the way a man lifts a weight he understands will break him. "You will not touch her," he said, "and you will not come into this canyon." Sterling Price, jacket pressed, hat clean as a lie, smiled without teeth. "Noble," he said. "Stupid, but noble. We'll be sure to put that on the poster." La. Being led in irons is a humiliation the body remembers differently than the mind. The wrists learn the language first. Metal bites, bone bruises, skin splits, where you forget to be careful because you were thinking about breathing. Cal walked back under a sky that did not care, between horses that snorted without whatever word passes for pity in a horse's heart. Men watched from doorways, thrilled and disgusted in a single expression. He held his gaze on a point on the far ridge, because looking at people would have required being a person, and that was not what the moment wanted from him. They staged the theater on the saloon porch, with the old cottonwood for a proscenium and a rope for a thesis. Price climbed up on a barrel and flourished his warrant like scripture. The town gathered the way towns do fathers with sons, men who liked to chew and spit where everyone could see, women with mouths thin because they knew what thin mouths had cost them. A drum at the edge of town began to talk in a way that pulled the heart tight. "Frontiers like a beat you can march to." "Caleb Stone," Price called out, savoring each syllable as if he'd coined them. "You are a thief, a conspirator, a murderer, and a liar besides. But I am generous. Hand over the Apache trinket, and perhaps you'll die in a bed instead of in the dust." Cal kept his eyes on the ridge. He could feel the rope the way a man feels weather. He could taste the old cavalry life in his mouth. Oiled leather, powder, the shame of seeing a village burn because someone had said the word pacify. He was not afraid to die. He was afraid to die wrong. Ayana's face came into his mind, not as a savior or a judge, but as an exactness he owed. The wind turned. The audience rustled like grain. A woman stepped into the street, then small, shawl around her shoulders, the preacher's widow. Miriam Hale, who had not spoken loudly to anyone since the day a train crew moved her husband's grave for a track they later decided not to lay. She looked like a mistake in the center of all that noise. She walked up to the rope with a basket on her arm, set the basket down as if at a church picnic, and turned to face 9 rifles. "No," she said. The word had the sound of a nail driven square. It wasn't a speech, it was a stake. The crowd, ravenous for stories without cost, choked on that little syllable. Price blinked once, then smiled with the malice that looks like civility. "Mrs. Hale," he drawled, "you'll want to step aside." She didn't. "I know what it is to have a grave crossed by a lie," she said, voice like plow steel. "I won't watch you make another." It should not have mattered. It mattered. Hob, the blacksmith, beard full of filings and sorrow, slid his hammer through his belt and came to stand beside her, not looking at her, as men do when they can't bear gratitude. A second shape joined them, the flour-dusted boy from the general store, handshaking but present. 3 people don't make a wall, but they make an idea of one. Cal felt something in his chest move once, like a shutter unsticking. Price's smile frayed. He lifted the warrant higher. "This is law, the sta." A voice from the ridge carried like water. "Number. This is paper." Ayana stood above them with a line of riders spread in a dark wing along the slope. The rug was rolled at her hip. Her face was marked in clean lines that read like a map only the land could write. The late day light put copper on the edge of everything, and a first drop of rain hit the dust and made a smell of iron. "You think this is a map to gold," she called, and the wind ferried it over their heads into their mouths. "It is a map to promises, to water, to bones. You cannot own what you bought with a lie." Jeb Price, who had waited because patience is a hunter's vanity, stepped from shadow with his repeater leveled. He sighted on Ayana's heart because he was not a poet. Cal could feel the shot before it came. Not because he was magic, but because certain ends have a rhythm. He bent his wrists. The chain had been worrying at itself on his skin since they buckled it. With a twist and a bite of pain, he pulled freedom out of the weakness of a cheap link. Jeb's finger tightened. Cal moved. He didn't run like a young man. He committed like a man who has done his math and sees the one correct line through it. He threw his shoulder into the guard's belly, stripped the rifle when the guard's hands forgot it in surprise, and drove behind the water trough as the street exploded into splinters and screams. He rose on a counted beat and took the barrel out of a gunman's grip with a shot that broke knuckles but spared a heart. He did not intend to be forgiven for everything. He intended not to orphan a 6-year-old because of a story told wrong. Ayana slid down the ridge in a spill of pony and grit and certainty. Jeb's bullet took a white divot from the rock, an inch from where her lungs had been a blink before. Cal's return shot tore Jeb's sleeve and woke the bone underneath to a pain it wouldn't forget. Jeb kept coming. Men who build their souls out of lead don't change material mid-battle. The wind chose that moment to climb a register. Dust billowed up like a curtain being yanked by a stagehand. The cottonwood rope creaked. Miriam Hale never moved. Hob didn't either. The flower boy threw up, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stood there green and shining. Price, whose courage lived entirely in ink, panicked like a rabbit that has finally learned the geometry of the trap. He ducked into the saloon and came back with a canvas satchel and a fuse like a black licorice whip. "Back," he shrieked, "or I blow this town into next Sunday." The crowd staggered, split by fear. Cal, on his knees and bleeding, pushed up in a ghost of the old cavalry surge and put one ugly shot into the satchel's handle. It lurched in Price's hand. The flower boy lunged with that stupid brave broom and knocked Price sideways so the fuse dangled, lit and spitting, not yet kissing powder. Ayana didn't go for the bag. She went for the fuse. She caught it with her bare fingers, pinched, and when it bit her she let the pain travel through her without letting go. The hiss died. Price looked at her like he was seeing something that ruined his favorite story. "Shoot them," someone yelled who loved watching more than doing. Jeb obliged, dragging the derringer he wore like a secret sin out of his sleeve, and aiming for the one thing in the street that frightened him, the woman who had told the truth out loud. Cal threw himself between gun and target because there are debts a man cannot pay with coin. The derringer barked like a small dog with big teeth. The world narrowed to the sound of dust on his tongue, and the pressure of Ayanna's hands telling his blood to stay home. "Hold," a new voice thundered, big enough to reframe the entire scene, "or I'll jail the lot of you." Marshal Owen Clay rode in the way law sometimes does, late, but walking fast. 3 deputies fanned out. Clay took the treaty papers the elder offered, read them with the care of a man who has signed things he regretted, and then looked up at Sterling Price like a teacher who has caught a boy with an answer copied line for line. "Sterling Price, you'll come off that porch," he said flat. "You'll come quiet. We'll let a judge sort your clever out from your criminal." Price laughed too high, because fear sits on a man's throat and squeezes in strange places. "You can't." "I can," the marshal said, and the town believed him because he said it like a man who has no interest in applause. Jeb, the arithmetic of his life collapsing under a hammer he hadn't counted, lunged at Ayanna with the broken arm and the knife left in his good one. Hob got there first, the hammer coming down, not like revenge but like punctuation, and Jeb folded into the dirt the way a bad sentence finally ends. The wind gusted. The dust became rain. Somewhere the drum at the edge of town forgot its measure and fell silent. They put Price in a cell that would remember him. They laid Jeb under a blanket that didn't. The saloon, because the West likes its metaphors literal, caught fire from the fuse tip Price had sprayed across the floor in his scramble. The bucket line that formed did not ask who had been called what name that morning. Apache riders and townsmen hauled together. Miriam Hale passed pails like passing grace. The flower boy found he was laughing and crying at the same time and didn't stop doing either. Inside the church, where light fell through warped glass in colored cudgels, Ayanna stitched Cal up a second time. He watched the needle travel like a rider along a fence line, counted the breaths between her knots, and thought about humiliation. He had worn it like a shirt for so long that he had forgotten he could take it off. It didn't leave him. It softened. He looked at Ayanna and saw in her face no victory and no martyrdom. He saw a woman measuring the present in inches, without letting the past be the only tool. "I was ready to let them hang me," he said, voice rutted with dust. "Not because I was brave, because I didn't know another way to end the math." "You are not a sum," she said. "You are a river." He let that in. It hurt. Good pain, like thaw. When he woke again, the world had edges he trusted. The judge rolled in behind the marshal, with a temper like a weathered fence post. He read the old papers, spat, and signed the new ones with a hand that didn't tremble. "Binding," he said, and there was a hush as if the word itself carried weight. On the boardwalk, some of the men who had yelled loudest in the morning found their throats careful in the afternoon. Hob came to Cal with his cap in his hands, and his apology shaped like iron cooling slow. He didn't say forgiveness. He didn't have to. Miriam Hale brought a cup of coffee that tasted like penance and put it into Ayanna's hand first. Cal walked, a line from pew to door to threshold, and the town let him. When he stepped into the evening, the light took a knife to his eyes and made them water. He pretended it was only the light. A gust ran down the street. The rope on the cottonwood swayed, and then, with a quiet slice, fell someone having cut it without speeches. The crowd released a breath it had not known it was holding. "Circles," Ayanna said without looking at him. "Lines," he answered, thinking of rails and ledgers, and the way a man's life can be drawn by other hands. "Rivers," she corrected, and the word made a sound like something finally finding its bed. The twist of the day, the part he would remember when the rest went to dust, was not the marshal's gavel voice, or the judge's hard pen, or even the hammer on Jeb's skull. It was Miriam Hale in her shawl, stepping to the rope with the certainty of a mother setting bread to rise. It was a boy with a broom tripping a man in a suit. It was Hob standing beside a woman because standing alone is a sin towns learn slowly to quit. It was seeing his life open, not like a gallows trap, but like a gate. Night came with rain the desert did not deserve and gave anyway. Red Rock Pass smelled like wet iron and new pages. Ayanna sat with her back to a pew, eyes closed, mouth relaxed in a way he hadn't seen. Cal watched the lamplight paint the barrel of his Colt where it rested on the table and felt, for the first time since he was young and dumb and believing in orders, that the gun might one day be only metal. He spoke, not to fix anything, only to put a shape around the air.